Korea's presidential contenders held their second live TV debate, this time on matters of social interest. We have more on the election campaign coming up next. Hello, hope you had a good weekend. You're watching Press Perspective for this Monday, May 26th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we cover the election pledges by Korea's presidential hopefuls to promote social interests. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia live on the line. Steven, we had hoped to see you here, but I understand your coverage of the election here in the country is keeping you quite busy.
Yes, work got in the way, but good to see you nevertheless.
Right, thank you for being online. I also have Ruy Valdes with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Ruy, as always, it's good to have you here.
My pleasure to be here.
Steven, we will start with you then. Let's begin with your takeaway from the second live TV debate among the presidential contenders that took place late Friday evening.
The impression that I came away with was primarily that this is not a super policy-driven election, I think. Like, this was not a debate where it seemed to me like the leading candidates had really sharply divergent takes on what the main policy questions were. I think that both of these, the main candidate, there were 4 participants in the debate, but this polls indicate that this is mostly a 2-person race between Jae-myung and Moon-soo. And I think if you were to lay their policy pledges out side by side, there would be a fair bit of overlap. Both of them are depicting themselves as someone who can kind of heal this particular period of turbulent South Korean history, who can calm the nation's politics and heal social divisions and guide the economy through this quite difficult period amid a lot of global trade tensions. So one thing we saw in this debate was, of course, there was plenty of policy discussion, and there were some meaningful differences between what the candidates put forth. There was also a fair bit of, kind of ad hominem attacks, or, candidates criticizing each other on mostly personal grounds. You had Moon-soo pointing out some of the kind of allegations from Jae-myung's past of internal tensions within his family, a kind of rancorous relationship between he and his older brother and his sister-in-law, and the accusation was kind of that Jae-myung ought to deal with his own family matters before he seeks to lead the nation as a whole. And then on Lee's side, his accusation was that Kim Moon-soo was if not perhaps an active participant, then a kind of involved by association, or kind of indirectly involved in the martial law crisis that was sparked by now impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol last year. And Lee was accusing Kim of being not the appropriate person to lead the country at this particular juncture, because he had, according to Lee, he had kind of a hand in creating this disadvantageous situation. So this is all, kind of typical of politics, where when a race is going a certain way, you see candidates seeking out particular narratives that they think will advance their cause. As viewers of this, I think we just have to hope that whoever gets into power will be able to address the very real challenges that the country is now facing.
Right. And before we delve into some of those challenges, Ruy, what were your takeaways from the second live TV debate?
Well, I would say that in terms of social policy, it kind of got lost in the crossfire, as Steven was mentioning. They did touch on some critical social issues, but the debate often devolved into personal attacks. This trend or we can call it trend, maybe it's more like the rule of politics. One is expecting that we will debate the details of their policies and what these candidates will offer if they get to become president. But it seems more that it was focused on personal criticisms and corruption scandals, etc., etc. Being that said, Jae-myung emphasized that restoring constitutional order and addressing social injustice will be priority in terms of social issues. Kim Moon-soo fixated on Lee's personal scandals. Kwon Young-guk of the Democratic Labour Party attacked the ruling establishment, pledging to end inequality and discrimination as the roots of disunity. And Lee Jung-suk from the Reform Party, the New Reform Party, criticized state inefficiency and dismissed Lee's Lee Jae-myung caregiving policy as financially undergrounded. A problem here is that key social matters like the anti-discrimination law that has been a main topic at least in foreign media, or immigrant integration and visa reform were entirely absent in the discussion. On a nutshell, we can say that the debate spotlight the candidates' divides, but not their visions. And Korea's voters, as Steven was saying, will have to wait or the details of the policies probably until the election is resolved.
Right. Right, so the debate back on Friday, Steven, was focused on social matters, as you and Ruy mentioned. The focus, of course, was social integration, pension and medical reform, as well as tackling the climate crisis. Now, that being said, Steven, what was Lee Jae-myung's proposal on countering climate change?
Well, Lee comes from the progressive camp, which has long been in favor of phasing out or at least drastically reducing the use of fossil fuels as an energy source, particularly coal. One thing we've seen in recent years is that data indicates that the air quality in South Korea has improved, a kind of rare bit of happy environmental news. And maybe part of the reason for that is lower consumption of coal. Lee is pushing to continue with that and to expand use of renewables such as solar and wind energy. I mean, that's where it gets a little bit uncertain. I think in Korea, the track record with those sources of energy is mixed. I know that under the previous Democrat Party-led government under President Moon Jae-in, there was a lot of expansion of installation of solar panels around the country that conservatives were quite critical of. They said that these projects were quite expensive and they didn't deliver on the expected energy generation. I'm not knowledgeable enough about the energy sector to say whether or not that's true, but I believe Lee got quite specific and he said that he would aim to shut down all coal-fired plants by 2040. Which is more ambitious than what the government is pledging to do now. That's as the current goals are more kind of like a phasing down or a reduction of coal-fired plants. Lee is pledging to go further than that. So, I mean, that's all welcome, but I think a criticism that keeps coming up in this campaign and of all political campaigns really is that the candidates are pledging things that are ambitious, that sound good and that are perhaps well-intentioned, but don't quite have the necessary budgetary details and the necessary details that would allow for a seamless execution. So let's just all remind ourselves that the election is not for another week or so, and we'll have to wait and see what the next administration does. But hopefully whoever gets into power will deal with these increasingly hot summers in Korea that we all have to struggle with, because if there's something that the public can agree on, I hope it's wanting a less hot and humid summer.
You're right. Climate action is something that quite a number of people here in the country believe should be taken. That being said, Ruy, what can you tell me about Kim Moon-soo's strategy in light of climate change?
Yeah, well, Kim Moon-soo criticized what is called the RE100. What is this? This is a global initiative led by the Climate Group and the Carbon Disclosure Project. It calls companies to source 100% of their electricity from renewables, aiming to accelerate the transition to zero carbon energy systems worldwide. Over 420 multinational companies, including Apple, Google, and IKEA, are currently participants, and many already sourcing 50% or more of their electricity from clean energy. What Kim Moon-soo says is that this is more a slogan and it's not actually a plan. criticizing policies that Steven also pointed out since the Moon Jae-in administration. He says that the real way to achieve sustainability is through nuclear energy. And he argued that nuclear power is safe, cheap, and low in emissions, and that it should be the main source of energy in the country instead of other sources like solar and wind energy that he signaled as problematic and overly dependent on Chinese imports, citing even also potential national security risks. Why this is important? Because he is not only mentioning or criticizing the fact that these other sources of energy could be inefficient in their own way of producing or achieving the objectives of renewable integration, but it's also important because he pointed out that it could hurt South Korean economy, damage its exports, and also, as I mentioned, since it will depend on Chinese goods, this will increase potential risk of national security. So basically, Kim Moon-soo is saying that these initiatives will not work and are even implied that they're like a fantasy to achieve.
Right. Stephen, Lee Jun-suk's Green Action appeared also to place priority on nuclear power, which was the case of Kim Moon-soo, as Ruy just mentioned. Could you tell us a bit more about Lee Jun-suk's pledge against climate change?
Yeah, well, there's a fair bit of overlap there with what Ruy just laid out. Lee was pretty vocal in advocating for nuclear power as a kind of high capacity and proven technology. He also kind of struck the tone of renewables as not being a reliable enough option. The history of nuclear power in South Korea is really quite interesting. It's something that the progressive and the conservative sides have not agreed on over the years and have kind of gone back and forth about. But one of the, and Ruy also alluded to this, one of the things that Lee Jun-suk said was that Lee Jae-myung, in his criticisms of the nuclear power sector, was being almost kind of hypocritical, and he was kind of undermining South Korea's prowess in this area as an exporter on the basis that Lee Jun-suk believes that these plants are safe and that they are clean and that they're manageable, and that the president of South Korea should demonstrate a kind of confidence and a kind of belief in these systems, and he should be willing to deploy them at home. He should not be criticizing nuclear power as a potential safety risk or a potential environmental risk while the country is endeavoring to establish itself as a major exporter and bidding for contracts overseas. That being said, there are some real challenges to nuclear power in Korea. This is an extremely densely populated country. I think if you look at the data on these matters, South Korea has, I think it's maybe second to Taiwan in having the highest concentration of like nuclear power plants to a population density. And some of the plants in the south of the country have some among the highest numbers of people living in their direct vicinities of any nuclear power facilities in the world. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But I mean, again, as someone who's not anything like an expert on the energy sector, I do think that there is a kind of emerging consensus, or a stronger consensus than there once was, that in this age when we're all interested in reducing carbon emissions and the consequences of carbon emitting industries, nuclear power plant is at the very least a promising potential source of energy that is less expensive than some of the other options available. So that is a debate that will continue in South Korea long after this election. And just one other thing, I covered the Australian election recently, and one issue that the ultimately unsuccessful opposition candidate ran into was he campaigned quite aggressively on the wisdom of nuclear power, but the vision that he was presenting was something that would take literally decades to implement. It would be 20 or 30 years before these plants could be up and running, and that's just in a democratic political system where there's a 5-year term. That's just a longer life cycle than is attractive to most voters in the near term. So I think the energy question is something that's very interesting, and it's a pressing matter for all South Korean households, but it's probably not something that's going to determine the composure of this particular election.
Right, Stephen, speaking also about Korea's nuclear power, Bloomberg recently published a related article adding that Korea is supposed to become a top nuclear exporter over the next 10 years. Now, you've clarified twice that you are no expert in this particular field, but based on your coverage thus far, what do you believe are the prospects of Korea becoming a top nuclear power exporter within the next 10 years?
Well, I can only really know what's been reported, but it does seem that like a number of circumstances are aligning in South Korea's behavior, to its advantage. So we have, as this Bloomberg story laid out, we have the customary heavyweights in the industry, the United States and France, that have dealt with some overlong production schedules, and they've been kind of overloaded with orders. And at the same time, some emerging countries like China and Russia face issues when they attempt to bid for contracts in Western countries because there are sanctions at play, and there's the risk that there's a perception that perhaps working with companies from those countries poses a national security risk. There's the risk of espionage or of any number of things. And as we've talked a lot about the Korean defense industry in recent years, and I've reported on that a bunch. And the narrative there is that South Korea has taken advantage of some favorable circumstances in global demand and in the composure of the global industry, and they've been able to leverage their reputation for working quickly and working accurately and being able to deliver large and complex orders on time because they have a pretty well-developed manufacturing infrastructure in place. This seems to me like something similar might be happening here, whereby amid the carbon phase out and amid the rising middle classes in certain countries, there's looks to be increased demand for some of these facilities, and South Korean manufacturers are well placed to step in and fill this demand. And this being, as we always say, this being a very export-led economy and a high-ranking task of any South Korean administration is always looking overseas and seeing where South Korean companies can fill gaps and where they can expand their reach and where they can win contracts that create jobs and manufacturing at home. So this looks to be one of those cases where there's a new, well, not exactly new, but there are promising new developments in a particular area.
Right. Moving forward, Ruy, Kwon Young-guk, he spoke about carbon taxes to drive forth Korea's green action. Could you tell us a bit more about his pledge?
Yes, this pledge of calling for a climate justice tax took over various parts of media, foreign press also, because he connected climate action to social justice. What he was saying is, well, first he warned that the climate crisis amplifies inequality with the most vulnerable migrant workers, farmers, the elderly, bearing the brunt of floods, wildfires, and extreme heat. Being that says, he pointed out that 43% of Korea's greenhouse gas emissions come from just 10 conglomerates and high-income groups. So what he's saying here is that the people who should be paying for these taxes is the wealthiest, or these corporations. He proposed a progressive carbon tax targeting major emitters and the wealthy to drive corporate responsibility and fund protection for vulnerable populations. He also called for a systemic overhaul, a new Ministry of Climate and Energy at the vice premier level, breaking off towards battles between the current environment and industry ministries, so he has more power, and a transition from fossil fuels to public renewable energy backed in legislation to ensure worker protection and community equity. Another of his proposals was transforming Korea Development Bank into a green investment bank to spearhead climate finance, and so on applying this carbon tax, which of course, draws inspirations to a similar carbon tax that has been applied in Europe.
Right, and that being said then, Ruy, could you tell us a bit about, for the sake of comparison, about the carbon tax initiative in Europe?
Yes, this is applied by 23 European nations as of 2024. They currently levy carbon taxes with rates ranging from under €1 to per ton of CO2 in Ukraine to over €120 in Switzerland and Sweden. The average rate is around €49 per ton, and the tax is typically applied to sectors like energy production, transport, and industry. These taxes are meant to incentivize emissions reduction while generating revenue to fund climate action or support vulnerable groups. This is all in line with what candidate Kwon is proposing, and this proposal, of course, reflects this European model of tax the top emitters and then redistribute funds to protect ordinary citizens. There are some variations in Europe. They don't all apply it the same way. Several countries combine carbon taxes with emission trading systems known as ETS, and market-based tools that cap and price emissions allowances. It's almost like you can pay to have the right to pollute, right?
Right.
So more or less, that's how it works.
So the polluters pay.
Yes.
So, Steven, despite the differences with regard to tackling climate change, with regard to medical reform, all four candidates, to a certain extent, agreed on the importance of assistance in caregiving for the sick. This being said, what can you tell us about the burden of caregiving on families here in Korea?
Well, Sunny, I think you're right to phrase that question as the burden of caregiving on families, because in South Korea, this is something that, care for older relatives is something that has fallen customarily on families. It's something that the society has typically treated as, something that ought to be handled on a household level. There's not a great national infrastructure for caring for elderly people who are no longer wholly self-sufficient. South Korea is now in a scenario where it's dealing with an increasingly unwieldy, what demographers call a dependency ratio, which is the number of people in a country who are economically productive versus the number of people that require someone else to take care of them. So meaning children and elderly people, and you have people who are in the quite challenging scenario of sometimes having to deal with their own children while also caring for their parents. Just reading some stories in local media, as the population ages and as you have more and more families who are dealing with these kinds of needs, you have improvisation and you have some, perhaps unexpected ways of dealing with it. I read a story in local media about how in parts of the country, there are growing numbers of what they call young caregivers. And these are people in their 20s or perhaps even younger than that who have been left to care for elderly relatives because, financially they're not in a position where they can have them admitted full time to a care facility, or they're not able to hire someone to come into their home and take care of them. And so then that creates a lot of new challenges. These are young people who are trying to get their own lives and their own careers off the ground, and they end up being saddled with this quite difficult task of caring for a relative. And then as demographers would look at this, another question that raises is, what does this do to these already economically vulnerable families if in the prime years of these young people's lives, they are burdened with these additional responsibilities? As Ruy pointed out earlier, this immigration is not something that has popped up really significantly in this presidential debate. But when you talk about something like the need for an increase in elderly care, the kind of elephant in that particular room is that one of the perhaps most expeditious ways of accomplishing that is increasing immigration and just having people from less developed countries who agree to working arrangements where they come in to do that kind of labor, which is quite difficult to recruit local people to do. But that's another quite difficult question. But what we do know is that this scenario of South Korea being an aging population is really taking off. And under the Yoon administration, I remember doing a bit of reporting on things that were coming out of the People Power Party and things that were coming out of the Bank of Korea, these kind of more drastic or ambitious claims that South Korea needed to do things like have a differentiated minimum wage, like have foreign workers come in and have them be paid less than locals would be. And that's just because they're dealing with this increasingly drastic scenario. So it's a question that requires an urgent response, definitely.
Right, for sure. And hopefully we'll have a response once the election ends on June 3rd and we have a new administration on June 4th. Steven, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Ruy here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Zong.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.